Right. Okay. All right. I got it. All right. So Marc Morano, who is the communication director for Senator James Inhofe, the Republican of Oklahoma, is on the line with us. Marc, during the congressional recess, I'm glad you have all this free time to hang out with us.
Yes, as I often say, the country is safe when the congressmen are away, and the staff are happy because we're in 4 weeks of recess bliss here on Capitol Hill.
Although your guy is probably not actually in recess. He's probably out doing something, knowing Jim.
Yeah, no, actually, yeah, he's going to be all over the state of Oklahoma, and actually, I think we're having a field hearing later this month.
Well, it's not Oklahoma anymore; it's Dumefistan, right?
Yeah.
Did you see that? You served the people of Dumefistan?
Yeah, this is Daily Kos's way of trying to reach out and and persuade the people. So by attacking the entire state, that's the way that they go about it. They said I was a skilled and prolific propagandist, so I'll accept the skilled and prolific part, but I would dispute the propagandist.
Now, for those of you who have not been following this, there's a small gaggle of people that really care about the issue of climate change, and they care about it not because the world's going to set itself on fire and we're all going to die in Dante's Inferno. They care about it because, number one, they love science, they love the study of it, and I know Senator Inhofe does, and number two, they know that this is junk science, and this is all about ending your lifestyle, and if they can control the carbon mark, then they can control the world.
Yeah, that's actually, Richard, you don't need to look no further this week than Reuters News. It did an analysis of the Lieberman-McCain cap-and-trade climate solution, in quotes. $500 billion over the next 2 decades is what that would cost. And I believe an MIT study, it was at $3,500 per family is what it's going to cost to do absolutely nothing to the climate. It's going to do a lot at great cost, cost a lot to do nothing climate-wise. And that's the same with Kyoto. Kyoto, Gore's own scientist, a man named Tom Wigley, looked into it. It was going to cost $300 and some billion the U.S., and it would absolutely not even have a measurable impact on the climate. And that's assuming you follow Al Gore's computer models, not even the real science.
Well, let me ask you, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday about the cover of Newsweek with the global warming hoax, and then with the asterisk about it that's being perpetrated by industry and all that. I saw a Reuters news story today that had Al Gore in it, and Al Gore was out there rambling on about how you see what the first thing they do is as soon as somebody comes out with a study that scares them, corporations offer a $10,000 bounty to go out and refute it. And I'm like just thinking to myself, $10,000 to sit there and spend a year of your life to study this, or $20 million to go hang out on a farm and watch cows fart, right?
Yeah, this whole thing. It is the biggest journalistic laughingstock of the last decade that Newsweek would attempt to make an issue out of some $19 million that anyone's come up with that ExxonMobil's given to skeptics, when the other side, the estimates are $50 billion with a B. And they could go through and say, oh, well, this group may have offered, $10,000 to this. Daily, and in fact, I try to chronicle some of this. Grants are coming out for scientists to study the Arctic, to study farm odors, to study heat urban island effect. They're money machine here. I quote a scientist named David Evans from Australia, who was a carbon counter for the Australian government, a PhD mathematician, and he just said he called it a gravy train. I mean, if you want to get funding in science now, say you used to work on endangered species, or you worked on tropical rainforest or botany issues, you have to now tie these issues to global warming in any way you can think of in order to get the funding. This has become the gravy train of our modern time. For Newsweek to miss the bull in the china shop and instead focus on a little piece of dust on the floor, that's the equivalent of what they did. It just makes no sense. I mean, if you look at this issue, funding fuels the global warming science 100%. I mean, the U.S. alone spends over $5 billion a year. The U.S. alone, since 2000, has probably spent in excess of $25 to $30 billion, and that's coming out of Washington every year, going to all sorts of scientist studies and in global warming mitigation impact studies, a whole bunch of stuff. To sit here and talk about the paltry and pathetically low funding of some scientific skeptics is just laughable.
Well, let me ask a follow-up question. Marc Morano, who is with Senator Jim Inhofe's office, he's Inhofe's communication director. Have you guys seen this study that these two German guys published back in July? I know that one of the professors' name was Schoensen, that basically said, wait a minute, we actually want to challenge the hypotheses that there is this so-called greenhouse effect. And they actually came to the conclusion that you can't even, in a laboratory, a physicist can't prove the greenhouse effect. Have you seen this one?
I have not seen that. Now, the CO2 is a greenhouse gas, but that's not really saying anything when you look at the context of this debate, because there's so many other factors in it. And as I think we've talked about in the show, CO2 is ultimately gets saturated in the atmosphere, and each additional unit of CO2 you put out has less and less of a warming impact. Think of it like your attic. You only put in so much insulation in your attic. It's only going to have so much of an impact. You don't put it all the way to the ceiling, because that would be absurd. It's the same thing with CO2. And I quote, and in our new report from the Senate that's going to come out this fall, it's going to be quoting PhD geologists from Ivy League universities and other places explaining that CO2, the more you put in, the less of a temperature impact. We may have already seen most of the warming we're going to get from any CO2, and guess what? The warming we may have received from CO2 in the last 80 years is not even distinguishable from natural climate variability. We quote Dr. Robert Giggenbach, the chair of the University of Pennsylvania,
right,
Ivy League University, as saying of the top 10 environmental problems, global warming doesn't even rank among the top 10 environmental problems, let alone a planetary emergency greater than the threat of terrorism, war, and all these other issues.
All right,
that's the real scientist.
Right, and it is. Well, you know, and I always encourage my listeners, Mark. I always say, listen, I'm not going to Al Gore you here. I will give you the summary. I'll read you the summary from the science, but I will publish the PDF file. I encourage you to go read it yourself. And I also encourage you, anytime you see end of the world studies, go read the actual surveys, and what you're going to find is every single one of them is an extrapolation. They don't deal in real world situations. They have these computer models that they try to formulate. Well, if this happens, then that might happen, and then this could happen there. Whereas the skeptics actually deal with real world. Can we do? I mean, the basis of scientific study, Mark, is can you? And scientific theory is number one. It's just a theory if you can't replicate it.
Give me 25 seconds. Let me see if I can do this in 25 seconds for your listeners. Anyone who gets in a debate about global warming, this is the entire debate, and I'll try to do it in 25 seconds. The New York Times has recently conceded that all current weather events are within natural climate variabilities, droughts, floods, hurricanes, everything. The New York Times has already said this, that it's within natural variability. In other words, nothing unusual is happening. Number two, the entire fear of global warming is driven by unproven computer models. Number three, a scientist named Dr. Jim Renwick of the UN recently came out and said half of the variables in our system are not accounted for in these climate models, so they don't expect to do pretty well. That's 1, 2, 3. We're within natural variability. Unproven computer models drive all the fear, and now those same unproven computer models, the UN has expressed a lack of confidence. When you add that to everything else, CO2 having a stabilizing effect in the atmosphere, when you add it to the fact that cow emissions are a greater threat to the planet than all the in terms of warming effect, than all the transportation sector combined. And then when you add to the fact that any so-called solution to global warming that everyone's talking about would have an undetectable impact, assuming their models are right, you realize this is not a scientific issue, it's a political issue.
Right. Well, it's a little longer than 25 seconds. Well,
the 25 seconds were the key science. I added 30 at the end, so give me a break.
Marc Morano is with Senator Inhofe's office. I found the study here. I'm actually going to email this to you.
Yeah, I'm not aware right off the top of my head what you're talking about.
It's great. It's called The Falsification of the Atmospheric CO2 Greenhouse Effect.
Is this by Beck or someone scientist like
this
that?
This is by Gerlich and Gerlich Tscheuschner.
Okay, I'm not aware of that right off the top.
These are two physicists that said, "No, wait a minute now. If this is all theory here, and if we can't replicate the greenhouse effect in a laboratory, then it doesn't exist." And you're going to love this. Jim's going to love this. These guys these are physicists now. These aren't good. These aren't journalists. They're physicists. They actually state in their study, it's 90 pages long, that the greenhouse effect does not exist. That if carbon dioxide was such a great insulator, how come we don't have CO2 blankets? Why aren't we out there insulating our houses with bubble wrap made out of CO2? if it's such a great insulator, which makes sense.
Well, the father of meteorology, Reed Bryson, who's in his 80s now, and this is a man who literally was the founding member of for the University of Madison, Wisconsin. He was the premier meteorologist of the 20th century. Now says that if we doubled CO2 in the atmosphere, it would have the same impact on our climate as spitting in the wind. And that's not to deny that CO2 may have an impact, but it's just to show you that what they've done, it's a trace gas in the atmosphere. We've already showed you that cow emissions have a greater impact. The UN is, again, keep in mind, the stuff I'm claiming, I always like to quote the other side. Like I'll quote the New York Times, I'll quote the United Nations, so people can't, it's not refutable. This is not, one of our skeptical scientists said. This is their side that they listen to. If you look at all the data, CO2 is a trace gas. You have the sun, which is at its highest level in 1,000 years. You have ocean current circulation, which they just came out with a couple new papers talking about, the Pacific decadal oscillation and all the flow and how that's warmed the northern hemisphere since the 1970s. You have clouds, cosmic rays. You have volcanoes. You have just a whole host of factors that influence climate, water vapor, things we don't even understand. But everyone looks at CO2 and says, ha, there's a direct correlation. Well, there is no direct correlation. You can go back to World War II. 80% of the CO2 was emitted, man-made CO2, came after 1940. Well, guess what? We still have temperatures in the 30s, particularly in places like Greenland. 5 of the 10 hottest summers in the U.S. were in the 1930s. Before CO2 would have had an impact, potentially had an impact. And then when the CO2 had a huge release, our temperatures declined in the 1970s to the point where the National Academy of Sciences, Time, Newsweek, and other scientists, and some of the same scientists today, were worried about global warming, global cooling.
Global cooling.
Coming ice age.
Well, listen, this is from today. This is a headline. Early 2007 saw record-breaking extreme weather, says the UN.
Yeah, this is, again, the UN is a political organization, not scientific. And this whole thing, I actually had a debate with a staffer here who works for a senator, I won't mention a name, but they claim that their strongest point for global warming alarmists are all the extreme weather we're experiencing. Now, keep in mind, I've already got the New York Times on record as saying that's bunk. Number two, Al Gore will claim we've had more record hurricanes, we've had more record tornadoes. When you look at it, you realize, wait a minute, they didn't have the satellite, the Doppler systems, the way they detect storms. We are now detecting tornadoes that we wouldn't even have known existed 60 years ago. We're now detecting them, and they're counting. We have a major meteorologist from AccuWeather who came out recently and said the way they're counting tropical storms now, they're counting storms they wouldn't have counted even 5 years ago because of all the new detection devices and these storms from their atmospheric detection. So this is essentially, a lot of people are getting conned into believing, and plus you have the natural inclination that wherever you're alive, things are the worst, or, it's kind of like the class of whatever in high school thinks that they were the best class ever. Well, whatever year you're living in, you think, we're unique, this is unprecedented. You always want to believe that naturally anyway.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is, if you look back at history, during the warm periods, the weather has been more stable, and humans and plant and animal life has prospered. It's the cold periods that kill the most people. It's the cold periods that are the hardest on the animals and other parts of the environment. It's just the whole thing is backwards scientifically, the way the media is presenting this and the UN.
Well, and if we allow this to poison other scientific studies, there aren't going to be any. But this was the point about the I actually got this from you, and I just want to let the listeners in.
Sure.
We have the communications director for Senator Jim Inhofe of Oklahoma, Marc Morano, taking a little time with us today. In that same report, early 2007 saw record-breaking extreme weather, says the UN. You'll find this quote in there. The start of the year, 2007, was a very active period in terms of extreme weather events, said Omar Badur of the agency's World Climate Program as he talked with journalists in Geneva. And then the writer says, well, most scientists believe extreme weather events will be more frequent as heat-trapping carbon dioxide emissions cause global temperature to rise.
Yes.
Badur said it was impossible to say with certainty what the second half of 2007 will bring.
Let alone 2100, yeah.
Right, quote, it is very difficult to make projections for the rest of the year, end quote. So this cockeyed kook.
Did you notice, if you have that there, maybe you could read the exact sentence. They cherry-picked January and April as the only 2 months where they said they were warm. Notice they left out
March and February, March was the coldest March on record in a lot of places.
So right there, the journalists and the UN are insulting you intellectually. Why do they just pick, out of 6 months of a year, why do they pick out 2 and then make some claims? The fact of the matter is, in 2007, this is 2006 or 7 they're referring to. 2007
they're talking about.
Right. In 2007, First of all, when Al Gore came to our committee and the Senate Environment Public Works Committee, the week he came, we had fire hydrants popping out of the ground in Anchorage, Alaska, because of the extreme record-breaking cold. In Alaska has had cold. We had New York City had record cold that broke either almost broke or broke record set back in the 1870s or 80s.
Right.
You have the Southern Hemisphere now. Chile, Argentina, Brazil having record cold. We're talking about lifetime cold, like since the 1920s, and first snowfall in Buenos Aires. You have the first snowfall in South Africa in some 30 years. Australia's having really warm times. You're having no summer. I'm sorry, Australia's having a really cold winter with snow. You have no summer now in much of Europe. In fact, there's articles saying we went straight from spring now, and now we're heading into winter. You have places in the U.S., the Midwest, that have had no 100-degree days, the longest they've gone this far, I believe, since 1918 or something. And now I'm here in Washington, D.C. We have not had a particularly hot summer. So I'm going to be real interested to see how this is played out in 2007 in terms of these temperatures. Of course, the global warming crowd will say, I try to call it climate change, anything that happens proves their theory, which makes it kind of hard to argue with them.
Well, it does make it hard, especially when they're backed up by every person that has a pen and a word processor.
That's right.
And it can blog somewhere. But someday the common sense and the science will win out, because it really is a money-making scam. For some, and for the rest of them, they're just evil. There's no other way to tell you this, folks, other than there is evil at work here. These people actually desire your standard of living to decrease. They'll be happy when you crawl inside your Adobe dung hut and when you're riding Gus to work after he kicked a couple field goals for the Giants. That's when they'll be happy.
Keep in mind, Jacques Chirac, the former French president, said in 2000, Kyoto represented the first step to authentic global governance. Gives you an idea of the agenda behind what they're trying to do. When you have most people left of the aisle, left of the center, left of the political aisle, don't really want to get into the science of global warming because they love the solution. They love the solution so much because it's more command and control of our government. And that's all they care about, because their solutions are so great to them. It's a way they can finally tax it. You mentioned, he who controls carbon controls life. It's a bureaucrat's dream to control carbon. Well, we are at a point now, human beings expel carbon. If they list the polar bear, the Fish and Wildlife Service, which are actually considering listing it as a threatened species, despite the fact that the numbers are up 4 times since the 1980s, and the only populations where they're declining is only because of Inuit hunting rights.
Right.
Hunting. We're facing a situation where, knowing the absurdity of our federal government, within a few years, if you're barbecuing hamburgers in Florida, you may have certain hours of the day or restrictions, or may have already hit your CO2 quota set by the federal government under the Endangered Species Act, because if your CO2 from your barbecue could go in the atmosphere and theoretically warm the atmosphere of the Arctic based on the science that they're trying to present here. So you're not going to be able to barbecue, cut your grass, light a fire in your fireplace, no matter where you are in the U.S., because it might theoretically impact the polar bear. I mean, we're facing a very brave future with this kind of logic and the way they're carrying this out. Keep in mind, and I've made this joke, if I was a polar bears are currently thriving. There's even the World Wildlife Fund has conceded this. The only threat to polar bears, the same with the only threat to Greenland's ice, are unproven computer models of the future. And I always joke, if I was a polar bear and saw a computer, I would run like hell, because that's the greatest threat to your life. Not to mention, some wildlife biologists say that polar bears benefit from global warming, and they've survived much warmer periods in the past. There's absolutely, and this is, you get down to the kids here, because kids are being taught that the polar bears are disappearing, that the future's ending. Washington Post had a great article in April, a great meaning it exposed the impact of all this. 8-year-olds worried about dying. Child psychologists talking about medicating kids of anxiety because of all these eco-doom fears propagated by the likes of Al Gore and nameless senators here in Washington. And this is the real frightening part. You have Leonardo DiCaprio's film coming out. He actually came out and said the point of his film is to scare, that he wants people to see a very bleak future. It's completely one-sided. He allows no idea that he's wrong, and this is going to be marketed toward the MTV generation. So, it's just a question of where these kids are coming out, because they're getting fed the propaganda in school. They're getting fed it in textbooks now. Gore's producer, Lori David's, writing a scholastic textbook on global warming for kids. And then, of course, they're getting it from all our pop culture. They're getting it from the news media.
That's right.
They're getting it from the global warming industry tainted science. I mean, it's really, you could get quite depressed.
What?
But you can't let that happen.
You can't let it get to you. Mark, we got to go. We're out of time.
Thank you, Mike.